Hamas likely planned their defense of Gaza and Gaza City the same time they planned their attack on Israel. So this is a long time coming. They have large stores of ammunition, weapons, medicine, food, water, all in these 300 miles of tunnels. And this is likely what's happening right now. So they have pretty sophisticated weapon systems they got from Iran that can defeat armor, whether it's a tank or an armored personnel carrier. And they've probably booby trapped quite a bit of buildings and quite a bit of the tunnels. So it's going to be very difficult. I've fought in an urban environment. It is very disorienting. It's very destructive. It's very violent. And I think we're seeing some of the videos come out that really show that to be the case. But I think there's probably a lot of casualties on both sides.
Military response to the Hamas attacks, which took place exactly a month ago. 1,400 people were killed and more than 200 taken hostage. We can speak now to Mick Mulroy, who is the former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for the Middle East. He's also a former CIA paramilitary operations officer. Good evening to you, Mick.
Good to be with you again, Carol.
Thanks so much for joining us. We were hearing from Benjamin Netanyahu that Israeli forces have encircled Gaza City. We've now had Israel's defense minister saying that its troops are in the heart of Gaza City and are reportedly on the verge of capturing some of the most senior Hamas commanders. What do you make of the way this military operation is unfolding?
So a couple of points on that, Carol. I mean, I think we've seen the way the Israelis conducted their preparatory, what we call the shaping phase of their operation. And in that, there was certainly legitimate questions about how they measured proportionality when it comes to a military necessity of a target. I do think that they're now moving into a different phase. They did what we expected. They came in from the north. They came in from the midsection to cut essentially Gaza in half, about where Wadi Gaza is, and they came from the sea. And they've essentially done a constrictor type maneuver where they've encircled Gaza City, letting civilians out periodically. But now you're going to see a really up close and personal fight. It's going to be building by building. It's going to be down in the tunnels, which you're already seeing, which is very complicated considering there's 241 hostages in there. And I think this is where you're really going to see a lot of, quite frankly, direct combat deaths, and it'll determine whether the IDF is capable of destroying Hamas as they stated as their objective.
Yeah, we've had this statement from Israel's defense minister saying that Israeli ground troops have stormed the terrorist group's strongholds in Gaza's main population center from all directions. He says in perfect coordination with maritime and aerial forces. Of course, it's very difficult to get any independent corroboration on that. And at the same time, you've got Hamas claiming that it's inflicted heavy losses on the Israelis.
So I think it's probably likely the case because Hamas likely planned their defense of Gaza and Gaza City the same time they planned their attack on Israel. So this is a long time coming. They have large stores of ammunition, weapons, medicine, food, water, all in these 300 miles of tunnels. And this is likely what's happening right now. So they have pretty sophisticated weapon systems they got from Iran that can defeat armor, whether it's a tank or an armored personnel carrier. And they've probably booby trapped quite a bit of buildings and quite a bit of the tunnels. So it's going to be very difficult. I've fought in an urban environment. It is very disorienting. It's very destructive. It's very violent. And I think we're seeing some of the videos come out that really show that to be the case. But I think there's probably a lot of casualties on both sides.
But we've also got reports of airstrikes in the southern Gazan cities of Khan Yunis, Rafah and Deir al-Bala. And this is going to be hitting Palestinians who may well have heeded those warnings to leave Gaza City, to leave the north of the Gaza Strip. I mean, I don't know if you were able to hear any of our previous guest, who is a Palestinian ambassador to Denmark, was saying that he did not see how Israel's response could be seen to be proportionate.
So this is going to be, I think, problematic for the Biden administration. They've pushed for a humanitarian corridor for civilians to be able to get out of the north where the heaviest fighting is. They won't do that if they get struck going to the south. So that needs to be something that's addressed directly, I think. And it's in Israel's best interest to move as many civilians out of the north so they don't have this much collateral damage. And essentially, they're just left with those that are fighting them, combatants. So I don't know the accuracy of those reporting, but I have no reason to doubt it. They need to, I think, have a designated route out to the south where humanitarian aid is brought in without impediment. And that's the best way to conduct this from a military perspective, not just from an ethical and moral standard. But in my opinion, from a military perspective, that is what you should want. So you're only fighting combatants.
Yeah, and I mean, we've got the World Health Organization saying the level of death and suffering in the war between Israel and Hamas is hard to fathom. And if we just look at the figures, of course, we can't be certain of those figures of 10,000 killed in Gaza. But I mean, that would suggest that the numbers of dead are approaching 10 times the numbers killed in that appalling early attack by Hamas exactly 1 month ago.
That's correct. And again, I have no reason to doubt those numbers, and that's the numbers that's widely reported. I do think that a lot of those casualties, of course, would include Hamas fighters, but came for this initial shaping operations with these airstrikes that use what's called ground penetrating munitions. And what that means is munitions that are capable of destroying tunnels. But in the process, they generally bury themselves around 100 feet down before they detonate. And if you do that in an urban area, it can cause buildings around it to collapse, which of course may not have been the intended target, but it is to your point, not in proportion to what you're trying to do, that you'd kill that many civilians. And I think that's going to be looked at later in whether they could have done something different. Not that it makes up for that, but I don't think they'll use those type of munitions in Gaza City when their troops are in there, because the chance of fratricide would be very high. So I think they'll have limited strikes in the areas where they have IDF troops in direct combat with Hamas, and that might limit some of the massive destruction that we saw early on.
But as you've suggested, President Biden and indeed the British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak have both said that they don't support a ceasefire at the moment because they feel that would be to play into Hamas's hands. There's also, frankly, little sign that either side is prepared to stop fighting at the moment for anything other than the briefest of humanitarian pauses. But do you think, as this fighting goes on, and the number of dead, including many, many innocent Palestinians and their children, do you think that President Biden and indeed the British Prime Minister will come under further pressure to try to do more to get some kind of at least humanitarian pause?
Yes, I think they're under a lot of pressure now for the humanitarian pause, which to me, it doesn't make sense why they wouldn't want to do it. It is in their own interest to ensure that civilians are not in the way. They need to get humanitarian aid, food, water, and medicine into the country. It is not only the right thing to do, it's required by law. A ceasefire is more problematic because the IDF has just now gotten into Gaza. A ceasefire, at least the way I understand it, would be they would have to withdraw from Gaza all the way out. If they did that, they would not have accomplished their mission of destroying Hamas. And I think every country that would have been attacked like they were on October 7th would not do that until they believe that the threat is now destroyed. And so the ceasefire is more problematic. They would likely, I think, from the IDF perspective, say that they have not accomplished their mission or even gotten close to it. But a humanitarian pause, a considerable one, so one that lasts more than an hour or two, I think should be considered. I do believe President Biden will push for that directly. But of course, they would also like to see hostages come out with that. And of course, that's a two-way street. Nobody's talking about whether Hamas would abide by humanitarian pause, whether they would not attack IDF forces that are currently in Gaza, because it would have to be a two-way proposition.
Let me just ask you briefly, and it's a big question, though, about what happens when Israel does feel that it has completed its military offensive. We've had suggestions from the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu that Israel would try to maintain security control. I mean, does that suggest Israeli troops occupying Gaza for quite some time?
It does suggest that, and I don't think that's in Israel's interests, quite frankly. But the problem is there has to be an alternative. They know part of destroying the enemy in military terms means you also prevent them from reconstituting themselves. So there has to be a force there that can keep the peace. It shouldn't be Israel, but the international community should step up and do more than just rhetoric. They should come up with an international peacekeeping force that is acceptable on the ground there, that's not Israel, that is trusted and can monitor, ensure that Hamas does not rebuild itself or some other group whose sole purpose in life is to attack Israel, and should keep the Iranian arms from coming and flowing into Gaza itself.
Mick Mulroy, former US Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense.